The crate slammed shut, and the world disappeared. One moment, there was the grimy pre-dawn light of the harbor, the stink of fish and salt thick in the air. The next, there was nothing. Just the suffocating, pitch-black dark, and the sound of her own heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Annabelle Whitmore pulled her son tighter, his small, warm body a tiny anchor in an ocean of fear. Little Sam, not even 3 years old, whimpered in his sleep, his cheek pressed against her neck. He didn't understand. He couldn't. How could a child understand why his mother had bundled him into a wooden shipping crate, whispering, "Don't make a sound, baby, not even a peep." The wood around them groaned as rough hands lifted them. Anna braced herself, her fingers digging into Sam's shoulders as the chest tilted violently, banging against the hard hull of a ship. Sam stirred, a small cry catching in his throat. "Shh, sweetheart," she whispered against his scalp, her own voice trembling. "It's okay. Just a little longer." A knot of pure terror had taken root in her stomach, a cold, hard thing that had nothing to do with hunger, even though she hadn't eaten in nearly 2 days. She was running on desperation and the memory of a kindness. The bakery girl had seen the terror in Anna's eyes and slipped her 2 bread heels, her expression saying everything she didn't dare speak aloud. No one else had ever tried to stop Rhett. No one ever did. Rhett Bowman was her husband, but that word felt like a lie. He was a gambler, a taker, a man whose soul had been whittled down to nothing by cards and whiskey. When he'd bet away their mule, the town just looked the other way. When the stove went next, and then the deed to their small plot of land, people just shook their heads and moved on. But this time was different. This time, he'd crossed a line so dark, so vile, that it had finally shattered the town's indifference. Through the thin kitchen wall, Anna had heard the words that sealed their fate. "You'll get a fair price for her," Rhett had slurred to the man across the table, his voice slick with greed. "She's still got a good figure, clean hands, good hips, and the kid's quiet, could make a good servant in a few years." She hadn't waited to hear another word. She had grabbed Sam, the bread heels, and ran. The crate was her only chance, a desperate last-ditch gamble dragged from behind a warehouse near the docks. It smelled of potatoes and dust, but to Anna, it smelled like freedom. She'd wedged them both inside just as the first hint of dawn touched the sky, leaving a tiny sliver open with a piece of torn sackcloth so they could breathe. Through that crack, cold air seeped in, and so did voices. "This one goes to Pine Hollow," a man barked from somewhere above them. "Way past Elk Ridge. Cold as a witch's heart up there this time of year." Another man grunted. "Ranchers only come to town when they're desperate, but they're still buying. That's all that matters." Anna held her breath, the words branding themselves onto her mind. Pine Hollow. She'd never heard of it. And that was good. It meant Rhett hadn't either. The boat began to rock, a gentle, lulling motion that did nothing to soothe the fear coiling in her gut. Her legs cramped, her back screamed, but she didn't dare move. She couldn't. Sam slept and woke, his small cries muffled against her chest. The darkness became a second skin, a timeless void where memories haunted her. Rhett's voice slamming doors, the clink of poker chips, the one time he'd kissed her hand and promised he'd be better. He never got better. He just got louder. Then, with a bone-jarring slam, the crate hit solid ground. Anna gasped, her teeth clacking together. Sam jerked awake, his eyes wide in the gloom. "Where are we, Mama?" he whispered. "Someplace new," she murmured, her own voice raw. "Someplace quiet." She risked a peek through the crack. Snow, blinding, endless piles of it. A single wagon waited nearby, its wheels half swallowed by the white landscape. A man shouted, his voice muffled by the cold. "That's the last one. Get it loaded up to the Dalton place before nightfall." The Dalton place. The name meant nothing to her, but it was their destination. The crate was jostled again, lifted onto the wagon, and then they were moving, pulled away from the dock and into a forest so silent it felt sacred. The road was a rutted, frozen track. Every bounce sent a jolt of pain through Anna's body. Night fell with a terrifying speed, the sky turning from gray to a deep, starless ink. The wind began to howl, a mournful sound that snaked through the trees like a pack of hunting wolves. The wagon lurched to a halt. Boots crunched in the snow. A low male voice grumbled something she couldn't quite make out. "Thought this was supposed to be flour." A long, heavy silence followed. Then the sound of a crowbar prying at the lid. With a final, agonizing creak, the lid was thrown open. A harsh lantern light spilled across her face, blinding her. For a heartbeat, the world was utterly still. A man stood over them, a dark silhouette against the swirling snow. He was tall, his coat worn thin at the elbows. A long, jagged scar snaked down the left side of his face, disappearing into his collar. And where his right hand should have been, there was nothing but a frayed sleeve, neatly tied in a knot at the elbow. He stared down at the woman and child huddled in his shipping crate, his face a mask of stunned disbelief. He blinked once, his voice a low, rough growl that seemed to come from the earth itself. "You're not beans." Anna opened her mouth to speak, to plead, to explain, but no sound came out. Her throat was a desert of fear. Sam, however, untangled himself from her arms, his hair a wild mess, and looked up at the scarred, one-armed giant looming over them. He gave a small, unafraid wave. "Hi," he said quietly. James Dalton just stood there, the lantern light flickering across the deep, angry scar on his face. He looked from the small boy to the woman, whose eyes were wide with a terror so profound it was almost silent. He should have been angry. He'd paid good money for a winter's supply of beans and flour, not this. Not a woman with haunted eyes, and a child with holes in his mittens. He should have slammed the crate shut and sent them right back where they came from. He couldn't afford guests. Hell, he could barely afford the salt to cure his meat. But the boy was shivering, his small body trembling in the frigid air, and the woman, she wasn't begging, she wasn't pleading, she was just watching him, her gaze as steady as the mountains around them, as if daring him to be the monster she clearly expected him to be. It was that look, more than anything, that made him hesitate. Anna finally found her voice, a raw, desperate whisper. "Please, just for the night. We'll be gone by morning." James straightened up, the movement stiff, his boots crunching in the fresh snow. He turned his back on them, looking toward the faint, warm glow of his cabin 100 yards away. "You'll freeze to death by morning," he said flatly, his voice devoid of any emotion. He didn't turn back around. He just started walking. "Get inside." The cabin was a single, drafty room, but it was dry, and the stone fireplace in the corner was roaring with heat. It was the most beautiful place Anna had ever seen. James tossed a few more logs onto the fire without a word, then gestured with his head toward a wooden bin in the corner. "There's potatoes," he muttered, "if you know how to cook." Anna nodded, her body moving on pure instinct. She led Sam to the hearth, wrapping him in a rough wool blanket she found on a chair, then set about her work. She found the iron pot, filled it with snow to melt, and lit the fire with a gratitude so fierce it felt like a prayer. She worked, and James watched. He sat at the edge of the room, a shadow in the corner, his single hand resting on his knee. He hadn't heard a child's humming in this cabin in years. He wasn't sure he wanted to. It was a sound that belonged to a different life, a life before the silence, before the scar, before the empty sleeve. But as the smell of boiled potatoes began to fill the small space, a smell of simple, honest sustenance, he felt something inside him shift. It wasn't anger, it wasn't pity, it was curiosity. Who was this woman? And what kind of hell was she running from that made a shipping crate in a blizzard look like a safe haven? The wind howled outside, rattling the window panes, but the fire held strong, a defiant beacon in the vast frozen wilderness. Anna sat on the floor, cradling a sleeping Sam, her own exhaustion a heavy weight on her shoulders. James stood by the window, his form silhouetted against the dark glass, watching the endless night. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was heavy, weighted with the unspoken truths of two broken people who had washed up on the same desolate shore. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, rougher than before. "You planning on telling me how a woman and a boy end up in a crate marked beans?" he asked, not turning around. Anna looked down at her son, her fingers gently stroking his tangled hair. "If I tell you," she asked softly, "will you make us leave?" The question hung in the air, a fragile, trembling thing. James was silent for a long moment. Then he gave a single, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "No." Anna nodded, a wave of relief so powerful it almost made her weep. "Then not tonight," she said. The truth was a tangled, ugly thing, and she was too tired to unravel it. More than that, she didn't know if she could trust him with it. Not yet. "I didn't come here to steal from you," she added, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "I was running. I don't expect charity. I can earn our keep. Just let us stay." James finally turned from the window, his gaze falling on the sleeping child. "I'm not in the habit of taking in boarders," he muttered, but the words lacked their earlier bite. "I figured," she said. He looked at her then, really looked at her. She was young, but life had worn her down, leaving its mark in the faint lines around her eyes and the weary set of her shoulders. Her coat was patched, her shoes were thin and damp, but she held herself with a flicker of pride that hadn't been extinguished. He ran his one good hand through his unkempt hair, a gesture of pure frustration. "I've got barely enough food for one person to make it through winter." "I saw the bin," she countered immediately. "There are potatoes, some salt. I can make it stretch. I'm good at making things last." James let out a soft, humorless snort. "You stretch it any more, it'll disappear altogether." A tiny ghost of a smile touched Anna's lips. "You'd be surprised." He watched her for a moment longer, a silent battle waging behind his eyes. Then, he turned to a small cupboard, pulled down a faded heavy blanket, and tossed it to her. "You and the boy take the cot by the fire," he said gruffly. "It's warmer there." She hesitated, the blanket heavy in her lap. "Where will you sleep?" "I've slept in colder places than the barn," he said, already pulling on his worn coat. He didn't wait for a thank you. He just grabbed his lantern and stepped back out into the swirling snow, the door clicking shut behind him, leaving Anna and her son in the quiet, fire-lit warmth of his home. As the wind howled, Anna pulled the blanket up to her chin, her mind racing. This man, James Dalton, was a mystery. He was scarred and broken, a man who lived on the edge of the world, seemingly by choice. But why? What had happened to him out here in this desolate place? He'd ordered beans, but he'd gotten people. He was angry, yet he'd given them shelter. He was a puzzle she couldn't yet solve, and as she drifted off to sleep, a new fear began to creep in. Maybe she hadn't just stumbled into a stranger's life. Maybe she had stumbled into something far more complicated and far more dangerous than she could ever imagine. The first light of dawn was thin and watery, struggling to pierce the thick layer of frost that coated the cabin's single window. Anna was already awake. She moved with a practiced silence, careful not to wake Sam, who was still curled under the quilt, a picture of peaceful innocence. She stepped outside into the biting cold, the air so sharp it felt like breathing tiny needles of ice. She scooped fresh, clean snow into the dented tin pot and hung it over the dying embers of the fire to melt. James entered a few minutes later, a gust of frigid air following him in. He stomped the snow from his boots, his gaze immediately going to the sleeping boy. "He all right?" he grunted. "Slept right through the night," Anna replied. James nodded once. Lucky. They ate the thin potato soup in a tense, shared silence. Anna couldn't help but watch him. The way he expertly maneuvered his spoon with his left hand, the empty right sleeve of his shirt pinned neatly at the elbow. He was a man accustomed to his limitations, a man who had adapted to a world that had tried to break him. After the meager breakfast, she found a small coil of wire in the lean-to shed attached to the cabin. "What are you doing?" James asked, his voice laced with suspicion as he watched her twist and bend it. "Making traps," she said simply, not looking up. "For rabbits. Small game." He looked doubtful. "You know how to do that?" "I lived near the woods once," she said, her voice distant. "Before." The word hung in the air between them, heavy and unspoken. He didn't press for more. Instead, to her surprise, he disappeared into the cabin and returned with a small leather pouch. "Bait," he said gruffly, tossing it to her. "Dried apple." Anna caught it, stunned. "Why are you helping me?" James looked away, his gaze fixed on the jagged, snow-covered peaks in the distance. His jaw was tight. "Not helping," he growled. "Just making use of what's already here. Wasted resources are a sin in winter." It wasn't an act of kindness, she told herself. It was pragmatism, nothing more. But as she headed into the woods, the small pouch felt warm in her hand. The snow was deep, but she moved with a quiet determination, her eyes scanning the forest floor. She found her first prize within the hour, a small rabbit, caught cleanly in one of her snares. By midday she had 2 more. It wasn't a feast, but it was meat. It was survival. On her way back, something caught her eye. A cluster of dark green leaves poking stubbornly through the snow at the base of an old pine. She knelt, her heart suddenly pounding. Her mother had taught her about this plant, years ago. "Worth more than gold, Annie," she used to say, "if you know where to look and how to dig." Ginseng. She dug carefully with her bare, freezing fingers, loosening the frozen earth around the precious roots. There were 4 of them, fat and healthy. She wrapped them in a piece of cloth from her pocket as if they were jewels. When she returned to the cabin, James was mending a piece of leather harness, his movements efficient and precise. Sam sat near the fire, humming to himself. "I got 3, she announced, holding up the sack of rabbits. "And something else." She unwrapped the cloth, revealing the pale, gnarled roots. James's eyes widened. He let out a low, slow whistle that was more surprise than sound. "Well, I'll be," he murmured, taking one of the roots and examining it with a practiced eye. "That's real money." "I thought," Anna began, her voice hesitant, "maybe you could take it to town, trade it, for flour or salt, maybe some seeds for the spring." He looked up from the root, his gaze sharp, analytical. He was studying her, trying to read the angles, the motives. She wasn't gloating, she wasn't demanding, she was offering. "I'll go tomorrow," he said finally, his voice flat, "if the trail's not iced over." That night the rabbit stew was thick with flavor, the first real, nourishing meal they'd had in what felt like a lifetime. Sam ate until his cheeks were rosy, his wooden horse sitting beside his bowl. After Sam was asleep, James sat by the fire, sharpening a skinning knife on a whetstone. The sound was rhythmic, steady. "You did good today," he said, his voice quiet, not looking at her. Anna, who was mending a tear in Sam's pants, paused, surprised by the direct praise. "Thank you." He glanced over at the sleeping boy. "He's lucky to have you." Her throat tightened. "I'm the lucky one," she whispered. The next morning, James hitched the old mule to the sled. He packed the ginseng roots carefully in a wooden box. Before he left, he turned to her. His eyes were dark, unreadable. "The men in town, they ask questions, they notice things." "What should I tell you to say?" she asked. "I'll say I ordered a crate of beans and got the wrong shipment," he said. "The truth is usually the simplest lie." He left without another word, a solitary figure disappearing into the vast white landscape. Anna watched him go, a knot of unease tightening in her stomach. He was a man of secrets, a man who spoke of lies and truths as if they were 2 sides of the same coin. She had found shelter here, but she was beginning to suspect that James Dalton's quiet ranch was not a haven from the world, but a fortress built against it. And she couldn't shake the feeling that whatever he was hiding from was far more dangerous than the man she'd left behind. The ginseng wasn't just a windfall, it was a test, and she had a sinking feeling that they were all about to fail. James returned late the next afternoon, his sled noticeably heavier. He didn't just bring back flour and a large bag of beans. He brought sacks of oats, a bolt of thick wool cloth, smoked fish, and a small cloth-wrapped parcel he handed directly to Anna. "For the boy," he said, his voice gruff as he turned away to unhitch the mule. Anna opened it slowly. Inside was a small wooden horse, carved by hand, simple and sturdy, its head slightly uneven. Sam let out a squeal of pure joy, hugging the toy to his chest as if it were the most precious treasure in the world. Anna looked up at James's broad back, her heart doing a strange, unfamiliar flip. "You didn't have to do that." "I know," he said, not turning around. That night, after Sam was asleep on the cot, his new horse clutched in his hand, Anna sat by the fire, sewing a patch onto his sleeve. James sat across from her, whittling a small block of wood with a sharp knife, his one hand moving with mesmerizing skill. The silence in the cabin was different now. It wasn't empty. It was full. "The storekeeper, old man Hemlock, he asked about you," James said suddenly, his eyes still on the wood. Anna's hands went still. "What did he ask?" "Heard I had a woman and a boy staying with me. Wanted to know where you came from." Anna's blood ran cold. "What did you tell him?" "I told him you were my cousin's widow from down east, that your husband died of fever and you had nowhere else to go." The lie was so simple, so complete, it took her breath away. He hadn't just protected her, he'd given her a story, a history, a shield. "Why?" she whispered. He finally looked up, his dark eyes catching the firelight. "Because Pine Hollow is a small town, but it has a long memory. People talk. A woman who shows up in a shipping crate is a story. A widow who comes to live with family is just sad. People leave sad be." He was smarter than she'd given him credit for. He wasn't just a recluse, he was a strategist. He understood the currents of gossip and suspicion that ran beneath the surface of a small, isolated community. He had survived out here not just through strength, but through cunning. The days that followed settled into a new rhythm. They worked. Anna tended to the small cabin, cooked, and explored the woods, her traps providing a steady supply of meat. James mended fences, chopped wood, and tended to his single, aging cow. They were a team, moving around each other in the small space with an unspoken understanding. But Anna started to notice things, the way he never sat with his back to the door, the way he would sometimes stop his work and just listen, his head tilted, his gaze scanning the distant tree line. The rifle was never just leaning in the corner. It was always clean, always loaded, always within arm's reach. One evening, a blizzard rolled in, a monster of wind and snow that shook the very foundations of the cabin. It raged for 2 days, trapping them inside. The world shrank to the 4 walls of their small shelter. On the second night, with the wind howling like a tortured soul, James pulled a dusty wooden box from a high shelf. He opened it on the table between them. Inside were a few yellowed letters and a faded photograph of 2 young men. They stood beside a wagon, both with the same dark hair, the same strong jaw, and the same slightly crooked smile. One of them was unmistakably James, younger, healthier, with 2 good hands. "My brother," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Lucas." He touched the photograph with a gentleness that seemed out of place in such a hard man. "This was his farm first. We were supposed to build it together." "What happened to him?" Anna asked softly. James's face hardened, the scar on his cheek seeming to deepen in the lantern light. "People in town will tell you he fell through the ice on Miller's Pond 5 winters ago. They'll say he was reckless." "But that's not what happened, is it?" Anna said, her intuition screaming at her. James was silent for a long time. the only sound the shriek of the wind outside. "No," he said finally, his voice flat and cold as the ice he spoke of. "He didn't fall. He was put there." Anna's heart stopped. "He got into debt," James continued, his gaze distant, lost in a memory she couldn't see. "With the wrong kind of man, a man from Leadville who didn't take kindly to being owed money. He came here to collect. There was a fight." He paused, his one hand clenching into a tight fist on the table. "I was out on the north pasture, mending a fence. By the time I got back, Lucas was gone. I found him the next day. The man was long gone." "And your arm?" Anna whispered, dreading the answer. "That was a year later," he said, his voice turning bitter. "A different kind of stupid. Got it caught in the gears of the windmill trying to fix it myself. Almost bled to death right here on this floor." He looked around the small cabin as if seeing a ghost. "After Lucas, I didn't see the point in much, just holding on, keeping the world out." Anna stared at him, seeing him for the first time not as a recluse, but as a wounded soldier standing guard over a graveyard. He wasn't hiding from the world. He was waiting. The story was a lie. The story about his cousin's widow was a shield for her, but the story of his brother's death was a shield for him, hiding a truth so violent and raw that the town couldn't handle it. A few days later, after the blizzard had passed, Anna was gathering firewood when she saw them. Two men on horseback, at the far edge of James's property. They weren't working. They were watching the cabin. One of them pointed in her direction. She ducked behind a thicket of pine, her heart pounding. They were townsfolk, men she'd seen from a distance at the general store. They lingered for a few minutes, talking in low tones, before turning their horses and riding away. That night, she told James. He didn't seem surprised. He just nodded, his jaw tight. "I knew the ginseng would bring trouble," he said. "Money always does." "It's not the money, James," she said, her voice shaking. "It's me. It's the story. Someone is talking." He stood up and walked to the window, peering out into the moonlit snow. "Then we need a better story." He turned back to her, his eyes dark with a grim resolve she had never seen before. "And we need to be ready for when the old one comes knocking." The fear was back, colder and sharper than before. Rhett was a monster, but he was a familiar one. The man who had killed Lucas Dalton was a ghost, a faceless phantom of violence. And Anna had the horrifying feeling that by running from one, she had stumbled directly into the path of the other. The calm was the worst part. For a week, nothing happened. The sun came out, melting the top layer of snow, which then froze overnight into a slick, treacherous crust. The two men didn't return. No one from town rode out to the ranch. The silence stretched, thin and tight, like a wire about to snap. James became even more vigilant. He spent an entire day reinforcing the cabin door, adding a heavy iron bar that could be dropped into place. He cleaned and oiled not just the main rifle, but a smaller, older-looking pistol she hadn't seen before. He was preparing for a siege. Anna tried to keep things normal for Sam's sake. They baked bread. She told him stories by the fire. They even built a small snowman near the barn. But the fear was a constant, metallic taste in the back of her throat. Every crunch of snow, every hoot of an owl sent a jolt of panic through her. "He'll come back," she said one night, as they sat in the tense quiet of the cabin. She didn't need to say Rhett's name. "I know," James said. He was looking at the fire, but his focus was somewhere else entirely. "But he's not the one I'm worried about." "The man from Leadville," Anna whispered. "The one who killed Lucas." James nodded slowly. Men like that, they have long memories. And long arms. Rhett is just a stray dog, all bark and clumsy bites. This other man, he's a wolf. He moves silent, and he only strikes to kill. The words chilled her to the bone. She had been so focused on Rhett that she hadn't truly considered the other danger. She had thought this place was a refuge, but it was a beacon, attracting the very darkness she was trying to outrun. The story James had told her about his brother, it wasn't just a sad memory. It was an active threat. "Why did you stay here, James?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "After what happened to Lucas, why not leave?" He finally looked at her, and in his eyes she saw a flicker of something she hadn't seen before, pure, unadulterated hatred. "Because this was his land," he said, his voice a low growl. "And because I made a promise to him right before, I promised I'd wait, that one day that man would get careless and come back, and I'd be here." Anna stared at him, horrified and amazed. He wasn't just a farmer. He was a sentinel. He had spent 5 years of his life in this self-imposed prison, waiting for a chance at vengeance. And she and Sam had just walked right into the middle of his lonely war. The knock on the door came just before dawn 2 days later. It wasn't a polite rap. It was a hard, demanding pounding that shook the entire cabin. James was on his feet in an instant, the rifle in his hand, moving with a speed that defied his size. Anna grabbed a sleeping Sam, her heart hammering against her ribs. "James Dalton!" a voice bellowed from outside. It was a voice she knew, a voice that haunted her nightmares. "I know she's in there! I've come for my wife!" Rhett. James didn't answer. He stood by the door, a silent, menacing statue. "Don't make this difficult, Dalton." Rhett's voice was slick with false confidence. "You're harboring a fugitive. She stole from me, stole my boy." "This is my land." James's voice was a low, dangerous rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. "You're trespassing." A cruel, mocking laugh answered him. "Your land? You think this pathetic patch of frozen dirt gives you the right to keep what's mine? I've brought the law with me, you one-armed freak." Through the small crack in the window curtain, Anna could see them. Rhett was on horseback, a smug, triumphant look on his face, and beside him sat another man, broad-shouldered and wearing the glinting star of a deputy. Her stomach plummeted. He'd done it. He'd twisted the story, painted himself as the victim, and brought the law to his side. "You open this door, Dalton," the deputy called out, his voice firm, "or I'll open it for you. We have a legal claim from Mr. McCallum here stating that his wife, Annabelle, has absconded with their child and property." James looked at Anna, a question in his eyes. Her mind was racing. This was it, the moment of truth. She could hide, let James fight for her, or she could face the monster herself. She took a deep breath, her decision made. She nodded once at James. He understood. He unbarred the door and stepped out onto the porch, the rifle held loosely but ready at his side. "She's not his wife," James said calmly. "Not in any way that matters." "That's for the law to decide," the deputy said, dismounting. Anna followed James out, stepping into the cold morning air, Sam clutching her leg. Rhett's face lit up with a sick, possessive glee when he saw her. "There she is! Annie, baby, tell these men how this cripple has been keeping you here against your will." Anna's voice when it came was clear and steady, forged in the fire of her fear. "He's lying. I am not his wife. He sold me. He sold me and my son to a man in Leadville to pay a gambling debt." The deputy frowned, looking from Anna to a sputtering Rhett. "That's a serious accusation, ma'am." "It's the truth," she said. "I ran before he could deliver us. I hid in a freight crate to escape." "She's unstable," Rhett spat, his face turning a blotchy red. "She's been telling wild stories for years." The deputy looked uncertain, caught between two conflicting tales. "I don't see any proof here on either side." "I have proof," Rhett said, a triumphant smirk spreading across his face. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper, handing it to the deputy. "Our marriage certificate, signed and sealed by a judge." The deputy unfolded it, his eyes scanning the document. He nodded slowly. "This looks legal and binding." It was over. The lie was official, the law was on his side. Anna felt the world start to crumble around her, but James stepped forward. He wasn't looking at the deputy or at Rhett. He was looking past them, at the road leading away from the ranch, and a strange, cold smile touched his lips. "You know, Rhett," James said, his voice almost conversational, "you should have been more careful about who you brought with you." Everyone turned, and Anna saw what James had seen. A third rider was approaching, moving at a slow, deliberate pace. He was a big man, with a cruel face and dead eyes. And as he got closer, Anna saw Rhett's confident smirk falter. He looked afraid. "That certificate is a fine piece of forgery, Deputy," James said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "But I have a piece of paper that's even more official." He reached into his own coat and pulled out a worn, creased document, holding it out. A 5-year-old wanted poster for the murder of Lucas Dalton. He looked directly at the third rider. "Isn't that right, Mr. Kane?" The man from Leadville had finally come home. The world froze. The deputy snatched the wanted poster from James's hand, his eyes wide with disbelief as he stared at the faded sketch, then at the face of the third rider. It was a perfect match. The man, Kane, didn't even flinch. A slow, chilling smile spread across his face. Rhett, on the other hand, looked like a cornered rat. His face had gone pale, his bravado instantly evaporating. "This is a trick," he stammered, pointing a shaking finger at James. "He's the criminal! He's been holding my wife hostage!" Kane let out a low, gravelly chuckle. "Your wife?" he sneered, looking at Anna with his dead eyes. "Boy, you sold her to me. The deal was done. You were just the delivery man." The deputy's head snapped toward Rhett, his face a mask of fury. "You brought a wanted murderer with you to file a false report?" The air crackled with tension, a single spark away from exploding. James hadn't moved. He stood like a mountain, the rifle held steady, his gaze locked on Kane. This wasn't about Anna anymore. This was about Lucas. This was about 5 years of cold, lonely vengeance finally coming to a boil. "It was a simple business transaction, Deputy," Kane said smoothly, his hand moving slowly toward the pistol holstered at his hip. "This man's brother, Lucas, owed me a substantial sum. He failed to pay. I collected. Now this one," he gestured at James. "He seems to think he's owed something. I'm here to settle that debt, too." "Enough!" the deputy roared, drawing his own weapon. "Kane, you're under arrest for the murder of Lucas Dalton. Rhett, you're under arrest for all of this!" But Kane was fast. In a blur of motion, his pistol was out. He wasn't aiming at the deputy. He was aiming at Anna. "Drop it, Farmer," Kane hissed at James, "or the woman gets it." Time seemed to slow down. Anna felt Sam clinging to her, his small body trembling. She saw the black hole of the pistol's barrel, the cold certainty in Kane's eyes. She saw James's face, a mask of pure, cold rage. Rhett, in a panic, tried to scramble away, but it was too late. He was caught in the crossfire. In that split second, 2 shots rang out, so close together, they sounded like one. The first came from James. The second came from the deputy. Kane's pistol flew from his hand, clattering onto the frozen ground as a red stain blossomed on his shoulder. At the same time, Rhett crumpled to the ground, crying out as the deputy's bullet tore through his leg. It was over in a heartbeat. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by Rhett's pathetic whimpering. The deputy, his face grim, moved quickly to cuff a snarling, wounded Kane, then turned his attention to Rhett. James didn't lower his rifle. He walked slowly toward Kane, his one good hand steady, his eyes burning with an intensity that was terrifying to behold. He stopped right in front of the man who had murdered his brother. "I told you I'd be waiting," James said, his voice a low, guttural whisper filled with 5 years of pain and hatred. Kane just spat on the snow-covered ground. "You should have stayed dead, Dalton." The deputy hauled Kane to his feet. "Let's go," he said, his voice shaking with adrenaline. "Both of you. You'll have a long time to think about this in a federal cell." As the deputy dragged the 2 men away, Anna finally let out the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her legs gave out, and she sank to her knees in the snow, pulling a sobbing Sam into her arms. They were safe. It was finally, truly over. James came to her, the fire in his eyes slowly receding, replaced by a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. He knelt in front of her, his one hand gently touching her shoulder. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice raw. She looked up at him, tears streaming down her face, and nodded. She couldn't speak. She just looked at this scarred, broken, and beautiful man who had stood between her and the darkness, who had waited 5 long years for a justice he'd finally delivered. "I thought I lost you," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she'd never heard from him before. "I had to stand," she managed to whisper. "I've been hiding my whole life. I had to stand." He reached out, his rough fingers gently brushing the tears from her cheek. His touch was hesitant, almost shy, but it was the warmest thing she had ever felt. "You don't have to run anymore, Anna," he said softly. "You're home." She leaned into his touch, the word echoing in the quiet chambers of her heart. Home. She looked at the small, snow-covered cabin, at the vast, silent mountains that surrounded them. She looked at her son, safe in her arms. And she looked at James Dalton, the man who had found her in a box marked beans and had given her a world. She knew with a certainty that settled deep in her soul that she wasn't just safe. She had just found the one place she was always meant to be. But as the winter snow began to melt, revealing the fertile ground beneath, she realized their story wasn't over. It was just beginning. The thaw came, not with a sudden rush, but as a slow, quiet promise. The iron grip of winter loosened its hold, and the world began to breathe again. Patches of brown earth appeared in the fields. The creek behind the cabin began to gurgle and flow, and the air softened, losing its sharp, icy bite. The change was happening inside the cabin, too. The silence was no longer heavy with tension and fear. It was filled with the soft hum of Anna's voice as she kneaded dough, the off-key songs Sam would sing to his wooden horse, and the steady, rhythmic sound of James repairing a broken chair by the fire. The darkness had been confronted and defeated, and in its place, a fragile light was beginning to grow. The deputy returned once, weeks later. He brought official papers from a federal judge. Kane was going away for life for the murder of Lucas Dalton and a string of other crimes across 3 territories. Rhett, for his role in the affair and the false report, would serve a sentence long enough that he would be an old, broken man by the time he was released. The threat was gone. The ghosts had been laid to rest. One morning, Anna quietly pulled the small satchel she had packed for her escape from under the cot. Without a word, she emptied its contents. The dried jerky went to the barn cats, the old scarf was folded and put away, and the rest was fed to the flames in the hearth. She watched the last remnants of her old life turn to ash. She didn't need it anymore. Spring arrived in a riot of life. James came back from town one day with a crate of chirping golden chicks that followed Sam around the yard like a tiny, fluffy army. Together, they built a new coop, fenced in a small plot for a garden, and turned the rich, dark soil. Anna planted rows of carrots, beans, and cabbages, her hands in the earth, feeling the pulse of new life. She was no longer just surviving. She was building. James watched her. He'd stop his work mending the barn roof and just watch as she sang to her seedlings, her voice full and clear in the mountain air. He started leaving small gifts for her on the porch railing, a handful of brightly colored pebbles from the creek, a strangely shaped piece of driftwood, a single, perfect wildflower. He never said a word about them. He didn't have to. One evening, as the setting sun painted the valley in shades of orange and gold, he came in from the fields and found her by the fire, brushing a sleeping Sam's hair. "He's getting taller," James said, his voice quiet as he leaned against the doorframe. "He's stronger," Anna replied with a soft smile. "He hasn't coughed once since the snow melted." James crossed the room and stood there for a moment, turning his worn hat over and over in his one good hand. He cleared his throat, a nervous, uncharacteristic sound. "There's a spring dance in town next Saturday," he said, his gaze fixed on the floor. "A planting celebration. I was thinking we ought to go." Anna looked up, her heart skipping a beat. "A dance?" "Yeah, he mumbled, a faint blush creeping up his neck. Figure it's time we showed the town who we are now, not who we were. Won't people talk? She asked softly. Let 'em, he said, finally meeting her eyes. Maybe it's time they had something good to talk about. A smile bloomed on Anna's face. Can you dance, James Dalton? A slow, crooked grin spread across his face, transforming his scarred features. It was the first real smile she had ever seen from him. Not well, he admitted, but I reckon I can sway in time with the music if a beautiful woman is patient with me. Then I will find my shoes, she whispered. That Saturday they rode into town as a family. Sam sat proudly between them, clutching his horse. The town hall was alive with light and music. When they walked in, the conversations faltered for a half-second. Heads turned, whispers started, but Anna held her chin high. She wore a simple blue calico dress James had bought her, and she had never felt more beautiful. James, in a clean shirt and polished boots, looked taller, stronger. He put his hand on the small of her back and led her to the dance floor. They moved together, swaying to the gentle rhythm of a fiddle. They weren't graceful, but they were in perfect time with each other. And as they danced, the whispers died down, replaced by smiles and nods of approval. They weren't a scandal anymore. They were just the Daltons. They were home. Summer came, and the farm flourished. The garden overflowed, the chickens laid eggs, and the old cow had a healthy calf. James built a new bench for the front porch, and they spent most evenings there, watching the stars come out, with Sam asleep between them. They were building more than a farm. They were building a life, piece by precious piece. One morning, Anna found James down by the creek. He was carving a smooth piece of pine, his knife moving with practiced ease. "What are you making?" she asked. He held it up for her to see. Carved deep into the wood were 3 simple words: the Dalton Farm. "I thought it was time," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Time to give this place its name back." Anna took the sign from him, her fingers tracing the letters, her eyes filled with tears. "It's your name too, Anna," he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble. "And the boys, if you'll have it." She didn't answer with words. She stood on her toes, wrapped her arms around his neck, and kissed him. It was a kiss full of sunshine and rain, of long winters and hopeful springs, of sorrow survived and joy discovered. It was the kiss of a beginning, not an end. "I will," she whispered against his lips. Years later, travelers passing through Pine Hollow would see the hand-carved sign at the end of the long dirt road. They'd see a strong woman tending a vibrant garden, a laughing boy chasing chickens in the yard, and a tall, one-armed man mending a fence, his scarred face lit with a peaceful smile. They would see a place where a family had been forged not by blood, but by choice, in the crucible of fear and hope. They had built their home out of the broken pieces of their past, creating something stronger and more beautiful than either of them could have ever imagined. Their story is a powerful reminder that sometimes the deepest scars can lead to the strongest homes, and that even in the darkest of crates, hope can find a way to breathe. If you believe in the power of second chances and the strength of the human spirit, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because there are always more stories of survival waiting in the darkness.